and we did Whitey Bulger in the Winter Hill game. And I'm Hannah.
I'm Jack.
I'm Andrew. I'm Lawson.
I'm Irfan.
Serene.
Will.
So our project over the last few months is to study the games. So we specifically examine the leadership style of White Bulger and how it influenced the motivation and the structure of the Winter Hill games.
You're supposed to do this in a way that challenges you to like your views of traditional views of like OB topics, and we want to do this in a way that makes you steps beyond the traditional way that OB topics are studied, and we want you to do it that makes you like think outside the box and not just at corporate organizations.
So we try to have a broader perspective about the organization behavior and apply it to the field beyond the traditional organizations.
So for Act 1, we're going to run you through an introduction to gangs in Whitey Bulger. So this is just a general overview of gangs. The two that we encountered during this project was the Mafia and the Mob. So the general definition of a gang is an organization of 3 or more individuals that identify themselves under the same status. Under this identity, they create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation to carry out their objectives. So the Mafia is an organized crime group that was based in Italy and slowly made its way into America. It evolved in Sicily up until the 19th century, and then the American Mafia came to power in the 1920s, which was different than the Italian Mafia, but they carried out the same thing, using the same code of conduct. The mob is a term applied to individuals engaged in criminal activities in an organized manner. So with the Mafia, you could be born into the Mafia, but with the mob, you had no such restrictions. People could come from all different kinds of backgrounds. There's no really set structure in the mob like there is in the Mafia. So for example, if you wanted to move up to be a leader, you'd have to kill the current leader in order to move up to that status. And mob leaders try to keep their identity secret. You could see this in the way that Whitey Bulger operated, because the community viewed him as a Robin Hood figure that did good for the community, but in reality, that wasn't the case at all.
Alright, so we're going to ask you to take out your phones, and if you have Twitter, if you don't, it's no big deal. But go to @OBMobsters, and there's a couple questions there for you to answer. Just answer the first one so far. And if you don't have a Twitter, the question is going to be, what age do you think Whitey Bulger started his criminal career? And your options are 25, 10, 21, and 14.
So the correct answer is 14. So Whitey Bulger was born in 1929. His parents were the first generation immigrant from Ireland, and he has 2 brothers, 3 sisters. He is the first child in his family, and Whitey Bulger developed a reputation as a thief and street fighter in South Boston area. This led to him meeting more experienced criminals. In 1943, he was arrested and charged with larceny and armed robbery and assault and battery, and he served in the reformatory for 5 years.
And then in 1948, he joined the Air Force, where he was an aircraft mechanic, and he committed he beat a lot of people up, so then he got arrested for being AWOL, and then he was honorably discharged in 1952.
And following his discharge in 1952, he started to see Whitey take a little bit more power. From 1952 to 56, he was involved in a string of armed bank robberies. These went all the way from Rhode Island to Indiana. And this actually ended up landing him time in federal prison for the first time. He was sentenced to 25 years and actually only ended up serving 9 of those. Part of this early release was due to his participation in a study where he was actually taking LSD for the government, and in doing so, many people attribute his mental state afterwards and some of the violent crimes he did to his taking of LSD in prison. Following his release from prison, which actually included a stint at Alcatraz, he was an enforcer for Donald Killian, who was another gang member in the South Boston area.
So this is kind of where we dive deep into who Whitey is and how he ran his gang. So like Jack said, he was an enforcer for Don Keelan after he got out of prison. And this is kind of where we see like his leadership style develop and grow. He was all about using force to motivate people and just violence to make people scared of him so he can get them to do what he wanted them to do. So, and that was the opposite of Don Keelan. So he was a man that kind of just was all bark, as you say, and no bite. And this really annoyed Whitey and thought he was so that caused him to think he was a bad leader. So in all, he killed Donald Keelan just due to the fact that he thought he was a bad leader, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. So he ran the Keelan gang for a while after he killed Donald, and then he took over for then he joined Winter Hill gang. Where there he kind of built this craft of using power and violence, and showed that he can be a scary man. And like this really resonated well with the leaders of Winter Hill gang at the time, and that's why he became a perfect candidate when Howie Winter went to prison for for fixing horse racing, and that's how he became leader of the Winter Hill gang.
So now this brings us to the actual structure of the Winter Hill gang and how Whitey fit into it all. Essentially, the reason they were successful for such a long period of time was the fact that they didn't have a strict hierarchy to abide by or follow. And this is kind of where Whitey fits into the whole thing. Though there are very few direct ties between Bulger and other members of the Winter Hill gang, make no mistake, he was the one pulling the strings and he was the one in charge. There were two main ways he kept control. Personal loyalty, which he got from friends and close acquaintances like his right-hand man, Stephen Fleming, and intimidation through ruthless violence. If there was one single universal rule that held true in the Winter Hill gang, is that you didn't, under any circumstances, ever cross Whitey. This aura of intimidation permeated the entirety of the organization and really became a key characteristic of the gang as a whole, to the point where the men who were the most ruthless held the most power. An example, and this also meant that anyone who crossed the Winter Hill gang in the slightest seldom lived to tell the tale. Ironically enough, a great story about this intimidation comes from someone who managed to cross the Winter Hill gang and come out of it with their life. Late 70s, a jockey by the name of Eddie Donnelly is given $800 to basically finish worse than third, but ends up allowing his horse to win, costing the Winter Hill gang about $50,000 in losing bets. At the time, that's a boatload of money. So the next day, Donnelly is invited to a bar in Somerville, Mass, where he's threatened by members of the gang and essentially told that they would kill him and dump his dead, naked body on the backstretch of the Suffolk Downs to send a message to other jockeys. The only way he escaped this fate was that he promised to tip them off on other horses to win bets on and help them recoup their losses. And you think now that he's even with the gang, he's helped them get their money back, that he's out of the woods and kind of in the clear. But years later, he's then called to testify against some of the people that were rigging the races, and the only reason he believes that he survived giving that testimony was the fact that Bulger and Flemmy were not among the men indicted for his testimony. So this just goes to show how deep that culture and aura of intimidation ran, not only through the gang, but also through the area of South Boston.
All right, so the next question is up. It's, do you think the community liked him? And the two choices, yes or no? And just like in your opinion, do you guys think he you liked him or not, or, yeah? Yeah? Seems like yes on the Twitter poll.
So for this answer, it was kind of a mix of both because obviously people didn't like him because he was bringing drugs into the neighborhood, but then on the other hand, he was using that money to give back, kind of like companies do, so he's kind of like a Robin Hood. And the neighborhood liked him because he did care for them. One example is a young mother went into a convenience store that he owned and was complaining about how her daughter couldn't play in the backyard because there was a bunch of needles from drug dealers. So Whitey and his brother decided to go to the drug dealer's place, board up their doors, windows, and say drugs sold here, and then told them they had 24 hours to get out. And then the next day they were gone, so kind of just shows how much he cared about his neighborhood.
So another way that he really ran his gang and controlled South Boston and just led with authority was that he used intimidation factors like killings within his gang to really motivate his gang members and the people in the community to fear him and do what he wanted them to do. And the main fear tactic that he really used was just killing his own gang members, which really resonated with all people in the gang. An example of this, and there's many other examples exactly like this, is one time at a bar, a member of the gang kind of stood up to Whitey and made a fist and didn't really attack Whitey, just kind of showed he was mad at him. And Whitey noticed it and was got annoyed at it, but didn't really do anything that night. So the next day that guy goes and apologizes to Whitey at his house, and Whitey accepts the apology and acts like everything's okay. But that night they see him walking down the street and they invite him into his car and give him a ride home. And the moment he steps in the car, they shoot him in the back of the head. And it's shown as an example of don't cross Whitey or stand up to him because it's not what he wants and it's not how to go.
So yeah, Whitey's personality was really fueled by his need for control. This was more obviously seen in his mob dealings, but it could also be seen in his personal life. During his time in Boston, Whitey had a bunch of girlfriends, and it was said that if these girls showed too much of a personality, that they just weren't going to work in with his way of life. A quick story behind this, Whitey came home one night to find his girlfriend at the time, what's her name, Teresa Stanley, having a casual glass of wine. Whitey wasn't okay with this at all. They got into a huge argument, and he ended up knocking her out cold. This really just goes to show that he really needed that need for control even in his personal life, and if he didn't tell you to do something or you didn't ask him permission to do something, then he really just wasn't going to be okay with it.
Yeah, so like Andrew said, Whitey really needed control. He had to feel that kind of security, and one way that, or many ways, most of the time, that he maintained that control was with connections. And you see this a lot in corporations and traditional firms nowadays, is that people have connections within politics, criminal justice, to help them maintain control and respect within the companies. And Whitey had connections and loyalty in FBI and politics because of his childhood friend, John Connolly, and also his brother, who was at the time a U.S. Senator. And then he also, just going through prisons and stuff, he gained loyalty with his, parole officer, reverends and stuff, which has gained a support group for him.
Alright, so kind of rolling off of what Serene just said, Whitey Bulger had a huge involvement, excuse me, with the FBI. And it's maybe something that you've seen over the past years as the story's kind of still unraveling to this day. But basically, without getting into all the conspiracy theories and details, as I could probably stand up here 20 minutes on my own and talk about this, Whitey Bulger was involved with a longtime friend, John Conley, and John Conley was the FBI agent in the area. And basically, this was a protection for information type deal. Whitey was receiving protection from the FBI through his use of John Conley, and in turn, Whitey Bulger was supposedly giving the FBI information on the mafia, which at the time was the FBI's main target. This really showed Whitey's ability to manipulate here. It kind of rose him to power, and this is what created such a lengthy and extreme rule over Boston for so long. The fact that he was able to use John Conley to get to the inside of the FBI made him untouchable by the Boston Police, the Mass State Police Department, and even the government themselves. So, as I said, he basically became untouchable in the area with his ability to manipulate others.
Yeah, so an example of like just a story of Bulger's connection with Connolly and how he used it to his advantage was there was an informant, McIntyre, who was on a ship that was dealing arms with Ireland, and it was Bulger's arms that he was dealing with Ireland to get involved into the IRA. And while on the ship, he called in a tip to the FBI, telling them in detail about Bulger's plans. And a few days later, McIntyre went missing, and then months later, he was found murdered, and there was evidence of torture. And it was believed that Connolly told Bulger that McIntyre tipped them off, and Bulger eliminated him.
So Act 3, we're gonna run you guys through Whitey's decline and his aftermath. So Whitey's downfall really started in 1988 when ties between the FBI.
Cool, I like that.
Want the picture?
Yeah.
So yeah, in 1988, ties between Whitey and the FBI started to be released. It was thought at the time that the FBI was too corrupt to be trusted, so the state police launched an investigation against Whitey to try to take him down. Shortly after this investigation, 51 of Bulger's men were arrested during a cocaine raid. Out of these 51 men, Whitey was not one of them, and this rose even more suspicion that the FBI was tipping off Whitey in ways that they shouldn't be. In 1990, John Connolly retired from the FBI. Upon his retirement, Whitey knew that he wasn't going to be able to be protected like he was in ways in the past. Knowing this, he started to prepare for his life on the run even more so than he has in the past. He started to put money in safe deposit box across the country with fake IDs so he'd be able to change his identity on the run. In 1994, Connolly's biggest tip-off to Bulger came in the form of a phone call. Pretty much just told Whitey that his time of power was up and that he needed to get out right now or he was going to be caught. Just like that, Whitey wrapped everything up. He picked up his girlfriend and he left everything behind. In the beginning of his life on the run, everything back home about him started to really come to the surface. And it was upon discovery of Debbie Davis's body, which was a murder that Bulger committed a while back, that the community really flipped from seeing him as a Robin Hood figure into the monster that he really was.
So as Andrew said, he was on the run for a while, but his girlfriend said she had enough of being on the run, so they set out down in California, and where eventually they got caught because she was feeding a cat every day, and their neighbor noticed that who she was. But while he was being captured, you really see like who Whitey was and his need to be always in control and the need for power. Because when he was arrested by the FBI, he was cursing at them and disrespecting them in any way possible and just not listening to anything because he doesn't want to get dirty, so he didn't want to lay on the ground. He just always needs that control for power, and you can even see that when he gets arrested. And he even said when he was arrested that he'd rather be on the run and be behind the scenes than be in a jail cell and not. He'd rather look over his shoulder pretty much than be in jail.
Though you'd expect that after years of being on the run, that Whitey's influence and power would have kind of diminished and faded away. Up until his capture in 2011, he still had people looking over their shoulder, making sure they didn't cross him. The fact of the matter is that his legacy isn't going away anytime soon. He has family that's still in Boston. There's remnants of the gang that's still there. The Bulger task force ran into a lot of trouble getting people to talk to them simply because much of South Boston still idolizes him and sees him as this Robin Hood figure despite everything that's come to light. So basically, his legacy is one of mixed love and hate, because you've got those people who are still looking over their shoulders, and those people who are still idolizing him. And this local loyalty paired with the fact that movies and books and newspaper clippings that have been retold his story over and over again have elevated his name to almost a household name here in the U.S. Has ensured that his legacy and power will continue well into the future.
Alright, 2 more Twitter questions and then we're done with Twitter. Sorry. The last, second to last one is which of the following leadership styles are seen in today's corporate world? There's intimidation, manipulation, betrayal, or all of the above. And it kind of seems like everyone picks all of the above, which is correct. Because even though they were in a gang and it's not a corporate world and not like a regular business, in the corporate world you still have these things that are not as prevalent as you would say in gangs. There's still, those tactics are still there. If you just look at any like corruption scandals within like big corporations, all those 3 things are really prevalent in there. And then the last one is knowing his leadership style. Would you guys testify against him in court if you knew anything about what he was doing?
Yeah, you would. I'd say so. Yeah.
All right, if you say yes, you want to give us a reason why?
Anybody?
If anyone answers yes, go ahead.
My dad grew up in Southie, and his dad knew like John Connolly and all those guys, and so my dad, he said that just the things that this guy did was just awful. So yeah, I testify against him.
Yeah, just like a quick thing is, a lot of people that did end up testifying against if their names became known, it was found in, like, that he had connections in media, and then the people that wrote the articles, the authors and stuff, they would slander those people that testified, the witnesses, so that their reputation was, like, trash afterwards.
Alright, if you said no, do you want to give us a reason too?
I don't want to get shot.
Yeah, that's a good reason, that's my reason. Alright.
That's the reason I was seen by many people. John Connolly, the FBI agent, did the same thing because of that.
I love it.
So through our countless hours of research and working together, there was a lot of downtime, so we kind of found a comparison between Mo and Whitey Bullies.
We saw some similarities.
Yeah.